I wish I knew.
So the question was left a little vague. Sammy writes in, who is your biggest inspiration?
Okay.
Now, that was it. I feel like a question like that kind of needs a second or third clause.
Yeah. I'm thinking if I'm just using context clues, we're doing a podcast, they're writing into a podcast. I would assume what's your inspiration to make a podcast
Okay, we can go with that.
is how I would connect those dots.
My genuine answer to start the last podcast we did, for anyone who knew about that, that was. What was our inspiration for that? Just kind of like a purpose?
I think
We
in that period in our life, we were kind of searching for a purpose, and we just wanted to do something that was like creative. If I remember, and like just trying to, it was kind of a way to find ourselves. I think that was kind of the idea, and it ran its course because it didn't really have a purpose.
Yeah.
The podcast itself didn't really have a purpose. It was us with friends doing stupid shit. It was the very early era of like podcasts, so people were just like, "We're four guys in a garage, like, just talking about hot topics."
Listening to
This is
music.
gonna age well.
This is the beer.
Just doing the Joe Rogan thing without having the reach of a Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Him and his comedian buddies, but we're just local dudes.
We're just dudes in a garage.
Yeah, talking. Here's what grinding my gears.
I guess the inspiration for that was ourselves, and I mentioned that because I think my answer for this, why we did this podcast again, was kind of ourselves, because like the things we talk about and the topics that we bring up and these discussions that we have are things that we're learning about or adaptive to our lives or things that we're going through, and I don't know, it's just kind of like we're just investigating ourselves in our own lives and thinking about these things.
Yeah, if I had to be honest with it, it's like not to sound pretentious, but a thing I enjoy doing that I've learned is a love language, didn't know it was, is sharing information. I genuinely enjoy learning about things that interest me and finding information that I think is helpful. And using an outlet like this to, like, if I can find things that help me through life, and then am I able to articulate that in a way that could even like have like one or two people listen to it and get something out of it, to me that's a win.
Yeah.
And that inspires me. And it's like I'm inspired to do it, but then people receiving it inspires me to keep doing it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of self-filling there, where it's like I'm, getting what I'm putting out.
Yeah. I mean, even, and just like on that idea, yeah, like I wanted to do this because these are things that I'm learning or things that I'm exploring and things that we talk about at work or just texting back and forth with one another.
Yeah.
Just like ideas that we're exploring that are helping me become a better me. And if we can compact these ideas and write a couple page report on it and then put an hour of us talking about it out, and if that can help something out, so I guess like the inspiration of inspiring other people or teaching and learning and spreading information and trying to communicate these ideas and maybe help somebody else. It's kinda the
If I like,
inspiration.
just like even for starting a podcast, like I've been big into podcasts going on probably like over a decade now at this point. It's kind of crazy. It's been around that long.
Yeah.
But like if I'd say, my early, like when I got inspired by podcasts, it was the early era of like, I got into like the Joe Rogan podcast and like I got into like different like video game podcasts, like nerd podcasts and stuff. It was like, oh, it's just cool hearing people talk in depth about things I'm interested in and didn't feel like I had an actual local community to be involved in. They like talked about that kind of stuff. You felt like it was like you were kind of an outsider, not able to talk about those kind of things. And then as that's grown in popularity, I realized like, oh, this is a big medium, and a lot of people do, want that like stimulus of having a good conversation, but not everybody has a close group of friends they can talk to like that. So the early years, it was kind of like those kind of things, like the comedy podcasts and like the nerd podcasts, like news type things. It got me. And then and that's I think what kind of inspired our first round of podcasting. In recent years, what I got into were podcasts I would say had more utility, because I'm like getting more into philosophy and like trying to like broaden my mind and like learn more things and like, self-help and these kind of things. So I got into more podcasts that filled that niche where it was like, oh, this is like learning. like this is like it's entertainment, but it's the idea of consuming content that you don't feel guilty about. It's kind of the phase I've gotten to in my life where I'm going to consume the content.
And get something out of it.
It's not junk food content.
Well, it's kind of like
So I wanted to make content that I felt like wasn't necessarily junk food. Like if you're going to take the time to listen to our thing, I want to the best of my ability and to keep doing it, make it worth people's time.
yeah,
Because it's not necessarily for me. I'm trying to make it. Like the old podcast was for us,
yeah. Us being dickheads, a creative outlet.
and like not for fear of sounding pretentious. The reason behind this one was to make it not only for us, but to also give what we find beneficial, hopefully, to other people. It's earnestly trying to build a community that's trying to help people.
Yeah, and that's why when someone messages us and says, "Hey, I'd like to hear your take on hustle culture," we do an episode on hustle culture.
Yeah, if we get a comment, like we had like one day someone comment about our episode 1 or get into the podcast and like how it actually they really related to it and stuff like that. Yeah, that's all that little shit like that is like that's so cool to me.
That's what inspires me. That's what is going to inspire me to do the next episode.
Yeah.
And do the research and take the notes and set up the podcast and take time out of our day and have the hours and hours of
Because
conversation.
I like having those conversations in person. Like I like got to a bar or you run into some friends and you just have a good conversation. There's few things I find more stimulating than having a good conversation. But sometimes you don't have people in your direct vicinity that you can have a good conversation with. And for me, podcasts were always like you're like a fly on the wall of 2 people, 3 people having a good conversation, a productive conversation. If you don't have that in your life, and we've talked about that before in different podcasts like this. Statistically, a lot of people don't have what they would call like a best friend or someone they can go have these kind of conversations with.
We'll be your best friend.
So it's kind of like, and that's kind of like the joke meme of podcasts online. It's like people just like sitting there watching, like, oh, it's just me and the guys talking. It's like somebody looking at like a poster of like people talking, and they're sitting there looking.
The episode of the Facebook episode of South Park was on last night, and that loser kid, like Kyle, adds him on Facebook, and he's telling his parents, like, "Oh, look, I got a friend. My friend Kyle, he's having pork chops for dinner." And it's like, is that what we're like? We're like, yeah, me and Joe Rogan, we were talking about this, and I learned this today, and he taught me this.
So I think, yeah, there's definitely the easy way to make fun of it, but it's actually a reality that a lot of people feel disconnected from people in their social life and the real life. And I think if you can find comfort in that kind of thing, it's big. But the idea is that hopefully it can give you more information to try and go about doing that in your real life. Try to also create social groups in real life. It is about finding a balance. I think what I've learned from podcasts over the years and doing them is there is a community of people out there. A lot of people do desire like intellectual connection with other human beings. And even just going out in the real world and being social, you'd be surprised how receptive a lot of people are to just getting to talk about something. Because a lot of times they don't have anybody to talk to.
I feel like this is this isn't a sneaky plug or trying to get views, but I think content like this, like what we do, not this episode, but our actual episodes, I think is a good segue for that. Like, you're at a bar and you're in a random engagement and conversation with someone at the bar, and you get on one of these topics like, "Hey, I heard this podcast, like they had a really good take on it," and like that's where I learned most of like. You just listen to
I've had that conversation with people so many times, and that's what made me realize like podcasts have become a big thing. It's just being out in public talking to somebody and like, oh yeah, listen to this podcast. They were talking about this concept, and you could tell they were excited to like unload that on someone. They wanted to share their findings. Like, oh,
Yeah.
I want to talk to someone. And I know I listen to Chris Williamson because like I love his podcast. He reminds me of like that. He's just like he's a hardcore podcast fan, and he just wanted to do it. But he's talking about like. Basically how he practiced for it and like why he got into it. It's like he said like he'd be with his roommates and he'd like read a book or like listen to a podcast and like they'd be in the car or going to the gym and he would just take like 10 minutes and just like kind of like rant about what he learned to that person to kind of like solidify the idea.
Yeah.
But sometimes you need that person to just like bounce the ideas off of to like solidify the shit in your head.
Well, that's like, you have a full understanding of something, a concept or a topic, if you can teach it to somebody.
And that's kind of what I've been trying to do with this. Like, obviously, not getting a master's degree in any of these topics, but like learn enough about them because I'm learning, and it's like as I'm learning, trying to like solidify the ideas in my head by, for lack of better words, teaching it.
Yeah, you teach it to me.
Yeah. And then we go here and we try and recreate those sessions.
So, what inspired this was us learning, trying to teach people, show people.
Teaching ourselves. It's
'Cause
literally started.
I've learned a whole lot.
Oh, I mean, next week's podcast is going to be about like a year in review thing, and it's like I'm pretty much going to go down. It's like, wow, this has been like one of the most insanely productive years for learning as a person, intellectually, in like life that I've had of my adult life. It's turned into like such a fucking wild year,
I think I've had the most,
like growth period.
certainly intellectual, definitely emotional,
Yeah.
intelligence growth.
Yeah,
this
and
year.
a lot of stuff we talk about deals with emotional intelligence, not just literally like intelligence, but like emotional intelligence, which I think is something I think people do kind of brush under the rug. Because you can meet the smartest person in the world, but that doesn't mean they're emotionally intelligent.
Right.
It's a distinction that I think a lot of people miss, and that's kind of what I'm focusing on. Because I don't think what we typically focus on. We're not like focusing on numbers. Once again, back to Severity, he's looking for hardcore data analytics. Like
The numbers.
we're not a business podcast. This would probably firmly go under philosophical.
I think we're
Just
labeled as self-help.
dudes. Yeah, like dudes who are not. I am not a doctor. I don't have a PhD in philosophy and psychology.
This is not medical advice.
Yeah, you don't take it. Like, take it with a grain of salt. But the idea is I'm learning about this stuff, trying to, dig into it. It's like, okay, I want to try and share my learnings. Earnestly share it. It might be, I'm not saying any of this shit's not false.
Yeah, I'm not saying that.
I am
yeah.
not an educated man who is interpreting educated things.
Yeah, these are not all scientific takes. These
But if
aren't-
it puts me on the path and it can help somebody else get on the path of learning more about it, then that's a win.
yeah.
It's not knowing that we're all screwed when we play our roles and ignore the problems. I wish I knew